You know what's hilarious? Voting for Brexit to take back control, watching years of political chaos unfold in the name of sovereignty, enduring endless debates about borders and bureaucracy, and then having your government quietly negotiate to hand chunks of that control right back to Brussels. And not just any chunks, the bit that controls your electricity, your energy bills, and basically whether you can afford to keep your house warm in winter. Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband are currently in discussions to rejoin the EU internal electricity market, and the price of admission isn't just money, it's nearly doubling Britain's net zero targets and letting Brussels set energy policy. So much for taking back control. Welcome to taking back control and then immediately giving it away again. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where we track every twist, turn, and spectacular faceplant of British politics. And this one is a doozy because it combines Brexit betrayal, sky-high energy bills, and the kind of bureaucratic overreach that makes you wonder if anyone in government actually remembers why Brexit happened in the first place. Starmer is pushing to get Britain back into the EU's internal electricity market alongside his mate Ed Miliband, the energy secretary who seems determined to decarbonize Britain even if it means bankrupting half the population in the process. But Brussels isn't just opening the door and welcoming us back with open arms. They've got conditions, big ones, like demanding the UK nearly double its renewable energy targets to match EU standards. Let's break down what's actually happening here, because this isn't just about plugging into a European power grid. The EU internal electricity market treats all 27 member states, plus Norway, as one giant borderless electricity network. It's designed to balance supply and demand across borders, theoretically making energy cheaper and more secure. On paper, it sounds sensible. You've got excess wind power in Scotland, send it to France. Germany's got surplus solar, ship it to Poland. Everyone benefits. Except there's a catch, and it's a massive one. To participate, the UK has to accept EU rules on renewable energy targets. And those rules aren't suggestions, they're binding commitments that would fundamentally reshape British energy policy. Brussels is planning to source 42.5% of its energy from renewables by 2030, with aspirations to hit 45%. That's their plan. Britain's current target is 22%, so we're talking about nearly doubling our ambitions in about 5 years, which is an absolutely bonkers timeline when you consider what that actually involves. This isn't just building a few more wind farms and calling it a day. Meeting EU targets would require a massive acceleration in decarbonization across electricity, heating, and transportation. We're talking replacing millions of gas boilers with heat pumps, forcing biofuels into petrol and diesel, and pushing far more people into electric vehicles whether they can afford them or not. Now here's where it gets properly infuriating. A document published on the Cabinet Office website, because apparently transparency happens by accident these days, reveals that the electricity agreement would make UK energy policy subordinate to EU jurisdiction. Subordinate, that's the word they used. The document literally states that to ensure a level playing field, the UK's renewable target should be comparable to the EU's. So we'd be taking orders from Brussels on how to run our energy system. That thing Brexit was supposed to prevent, that entire concept of sovereignty and making our own decisions. Yeah, that's getting tossed out the window faster than you can say Northern Ireland Protocol. Shadow Energy Secretary Claire Coutinho is absolutely furious about this, and honestly, you can understand why. She's accused Starmer of surrendering control of Britain's energy system to bureaucrats in Brussels, which is pretty much exactly what's happening. Her warning is stark. UK ministers will be forced to reduce emissions regardless of what it does to people's energy bills or the competitiveness of British businesses. That's the trade-off. Environmental targets that sound lovely in theory, but could absolutely hammer ordinary people trying to pay their bills and businesses trying to stay competitive. And the decision-making power won't even be in British hands anymore. Coutinho also compared the EU's Renewable Energy Directive to the worst parts of the UK Climate Change Act on steroids, which is quite the visual. The Climate Change Act has already been criticized for setting targets without properly considering the economic costs or practical challenges. Now imagine that, but amplified and controlled by Brussels. You've got unelected EU officials setting requirements that British ministers have to implement, even if they're wildly impractical or economically devastating. That's not taking back control, that's outsourcing control to the very institution Brexit was meant to free us from. Let's talk about what these targets actually mean in practice, because this isn't just abstract policy wonkery. This affects real people in real ways. Ed Miliband has already set a target for 95% decarbonization of power generation by 2030. That's ambitious on its own. But electricity only accounts for about a fifth of total domestic energy consumption. To hit the EU's overall renewable target, you need to decarbonize heating and transport too. And that's where things get expensive and complicated very quickly. Heating is a massive challenge. Most British homes use gas boilers. They're cheap to install, relatively efficient, and people understand how they work. Heat pumps, which are the main alternative, cost thousands of pounds more up front. They work brilliantly in well-insulated modern homes, but can be less effective in older properties, which describes most of Britain's housing stock. Forcing a rapid transition to heat pumps means either the government subsidizes them heavily, which costs taxpayers a fortune, or homeowners pay out of pocket, which most can't afford. Either way, someone's getting hammered financially. Transportation is equally tricky. Electric vehicles are improving, but they're still more expensive than petrol cars, especially up front. Charging infrastructure is patchy outside major cities. If you live in a flat or don't have a driveway, where exactly are you supposed to charge? The used EV market is still developing, so people on tighter budgets don't have many options. And now we're talking about accelerating this transition to meet Brussels' timeline rather than letting it develop naturally as technology improves and costs come down. That's a recipe for social inequality, where wealthier people can afford to comply and everyone else gets left behind or penalized. Then there's the biofuels question. Adding biofuels to petrol and diesel sounds environmentally friendly until you look at the details. Growing crops for fuel competes with growing food. It requires land, water, and resources. The carbon savings aren't always as impressive as claimed once you factor in the full life cycle. And it adds cost to fuel, which means higher prices at the pump, which disproportionately affects people who can't afford newer vehicles or who live in rural areas where public transport isn't an option. These aren't minor inconveniences. These are major financial burdens being imposed on people who are already struggling. Energy experts speaking to The Telegraph made it clear that meeting the EU target would require exactly this kind of massive acceleration across all sectors. It's not optional nice-to-haves. It's mandatory transformation driven by Brussels' timeline rather than Britain's needs or capabilities. And the consequences for energy bills could be severe. Transitioning this quickly costs enormous amounts of money. That money comes from somewhere, either general taxation or energy bills themselves. Probably both. So people end up paying twice, once through taxes for subsidies and infrastructure, and again through higher bills to cover the costs built into the energy system. Now let's address the elephant in the room, Brexit. Remember Brexit? That whole thing where Britain voted to leave the EU specifically to regain sovereignty and control over its own affairs? Where people were told that faceless Brussels bureaucrats would no longer dictate British policy? Where taking back control became the defining slogan of an entire political movement? Well, apparently, taking back control only lasted until it became inconvenient, at which point Labour decided actually maybe letting Brussels control energy policy isn't such a bad idea after all. The political optics of this are absolutely disastrous. You've got millions of Leave voters who specifically voted to get away from EU control now watching their government voluntarily submit to EU jurisdiction over a massive area of policy. It doesn't matter that the electricity market might have technical benefits. It doesn't matter that cooperation theoretically could lower costs, which is debatable anyway, given the expensive conditions attached. What matters is the perception that Brexit is being betrayed, that the decision of the British people is being undermined, that politicians said one thing and are now doing another.
And it's not like Starmer can claim ignorance here. He knows exactly what he's doing. He was pushing for a second referendum during the Brexit debates. He's never been shy about his preference for closer EU ties. But he won an election partly because Brexit had become exhausting and people wanted to move on. Nobody voted Labour thinking they'd immediately start surrendering policy control back to Brussels. That wasn't in the manifesto. That wasn't part of the pitch. This is happening through quiet negotiations and documents published on government websites that most people will never see, which makes it feel sneaky and dishonest. The Cabinet Office response to all this is predictably bland. They said agreed text between the EU and UK would form the basis for further talks in 2026, and that closer cooperation would bring real benefits to businesses and consumers by driving down costs, strengthening security, and driving investment. Then they added they won't give a running commentary on ongoing talks, which is politician speak for we're doing this whether you like it or not, and we'd rather not have to defend it publicly until it's too late to stop. But here's the thing about driving down costs. That only works if the conditions attached don't outweigh the benefits. If rejoining the internal market requires Britain to spend hundreds of billions accelerating decarbonization to meet Brussels' targets, how exactly does that drive down costs? The math doesn't add up. Sure, interconnected grids can balance supply and demand more efficiently, but if you're forced to invest massive sums in